Give comments. This is an open space. We welcome challenges. The topic is complex, nuanced, sometimes messy. So we absolutely welcome any kind of thoughts that come through. You can use the yes, no, thumbs up function to demonstrate whether you agree or disagree. I'm not sure we'll necessarily use that, but we might do. And to raise your hand, either just raise your hand or use the reaction buttons. We hope to hear your voices during the session, but we also understand that when we've got a number of people, it might feel a little bit kind of awkward and clunky to jump in with our voices. So if you feel that you want to say something, but you'd rather say it in the chat, we're absolutely happy with that as well. Okay, so we're going to look at anti-racism through storytelling. And in the process, we're going to be exploring what we mean by storytelling and what we mean by anti-racism. And all that is within a school context, of course, but with a global view. So with structural views around what stories are in a global universal sense, so that we can reflect back into what are we doing in schools and how does that ripple out into how children and we end up living in the world based on the stories we tell others and we tell ourselves. And the aims of this workshop are to find out about our project, which really absolutely got us stuck into this issue in the first place, how to use a critical literacy framework just to help us assess anti-racist material for the classroom, to understand the powerful role that stories play in maintaining, resisting, or transforming narratives around racism and discrimination. And you'll see that the way we're speaking about racism also applies to other forms of oppression and discrimination as well. And these three elements of maintaining, resisting, and transforming are what we'd love for you to keep in mind as we're speaking through this next hour. And we will, of course, share with you resources and how to find out more about them. And these are all free resources, by the way, that were born out of the project. The project is called Sankofa. Can I just get a show of hands? Does Sankofa mean anything to anyone? For anyone already familiar? I know we get to cheat a little bit because we're seeing it in front of us. But if we can get a raised hands if people have come across this term before. Okay. Thank you. Yeah, so this notion of going back to get it, and this is a word that comes from the Twi language of Ghana, and it just shows this kind of wisdom that can get silenced in some of our obsession with progress and growth. So this idea that in order for us to move forward, we need to look back. And so that's why we see, here it is, the logo for this project is of this bird that's looking back, but walking forward. So this idea that there's something in our ancestry and the collective canon of human sense-making and world-making that we need to draw on if we are to move forward with consciousness and intention. So to presence ourselves in the present, to look towards the future by ensuring that we know what's come before us. And stories are an incredible vessel for us to understand what has come before us, how they're passed on from our ancestors through to us, and how we need to also carry them through. And what kinds of stories do we want to hold on to if we are to think about the better life that we wish for ourselves and for others in this earth, and also to address the most urgent challenges that we're facing today? Because we are in a period, possibly more so than ever, where we need this hope. We need hope. Hope is something that feels intangible at the moment. And so what resilience can stories give us in the construction of hope? So we partnered with Cumbria Development Education Centre, who are the leads of this project. They led on this project. And also with Sever in the Czech Republic and with Sosna in Slovakia. So in the process of trying to make sense we also had this process of trying to understand each other and each other's cultures, which is always a clunky process. And it was definitely a clunky process for us as we went through it. What do we even mean by story? We even had to go back and try to make sense together about what do we even mean by story? What is storytelling? So it was a brilliant process of deconstructing to come back together and make sense. So what mediums do we use to tell stories today? So at this point, we'd love to invite you to put into the chat box what mediums we use to tell stories. What are the mediums that we have for sharing stories? Go ahead into the chat box. Let me...
Helen says text, Christina blog, Erica, social media from Helen, Erica song. We have loads. Props model from Althea. Helen says letters.
Movies, online journals. Rachel's asking, what is a helicopter story? I had the same question, Rachel. So I don't know if Althea, are you happy to tell us what a helicopter story is? Are you typing it in? Would you like to speak it out?
We can't hear you right now. Yeah. No.
Oh no, is the mic? Oh well.
Yeah, I think she might be typing because I don't think the mic works on the classroom computer. Yeah.
Oh, I see.
We'll wait a second.
Yeah.
Comics, Anna says comics, TV, books in all forms. And Anna's helping us with helicopter stories had made in a ring in the classroom with children creating ideas.
Love that. Absolutely.
Thank you, Anna.
And love that idea, absolutely, of co-creating stories with children, an absolutely important form of creating and co-creating. This is, for me, a new term, helicopter stories. And I call myself a professional storyteller, so shame on me. Thank you. We always enter these spaces in the knowledge that we're going to learn. So thank you very much for sharing that. Poetry as well, thank you. Graffiti, craft, yes. Rituals, oh, I'm loving what's coming through. Newspapers, the news, that's storytelling. Knitting, some really interesting ideas coming through. Zines, yeah, absolutely, really interesting.
All microphones. How about now? Is that me?
Oh, yes.
Okay, there's a horrible echo, but I'll just rattle on. So I can't remember the name of the woman who created it, but I will find out. And the idea is that children can share stories through their own imagination. So you're sitting in a circle, and before that, the adult has an A5 piece of paper that they describe exactly what the child is saying. And that child then comes together with the group at the end of a day to share what it was. So even if they said the cat, they would come into the middle of the circle and perform being the cat, and then it move on to the next person's story, and everyone is praised and recognized for their efforts.
Love that. Thank you so much for sharing, Althea. And also this idea of recognizing and sharing and acknowledging and listening and assuring people that they're heard. Giving that, I hear you. That's such an important element of storytelling, isn't it? So absolutely everything you've said. And in fact, this image here doesn't even begin to capture everything that you have shared around rituals and crafts and newspapers and absolutely all of these things weaved in together. Stories are so much more than the books that we read. They're everywhere. They're all around us. So in the knowledge that stories are all around us and come in these different forms and formats and texts, and in the knowledge that we allow them into our lives and into our classrooms, we just want to, oops, is that what we're, yes. We just want to share with you a poll that we're going to do with you. So Trini is going to share in the chat box a Mentimeter link. If you click on that link and answer the questions, we'll be able to see live where we stand on a variety of statements. So just click on the link in the chat, go to Mentimeter, and start.
If you can just slide the dots across to see if you disagree, and 0, or agree, 10. So just slide, and once you're done with the purple one, the last one, you press submit, and we should be able to see answers live.
Oh, can't see the link. Maybe if we put it again.
Will do.
Thank you. We're going to share the link again. And what you'll see is www.menti.com. That's the link that we want. Did we put it? Here it is. So I've just popped it in. And Trini has just popped it in as well.
Sorry. Oh, there we go.
Here we go. We're
You
starting
see?
to see.
There we go. Thank you. Sorry about that.
Lovely. And please keep going while I'm talking through this, anyone who's still going through the process. Yeah, it's very interesting. So from a very young age, stories shape our view of the world and our place within it. And we can see that there's a high level of agreement there. Storytelling can change the world, and a high level agreement there. Stories are just a bit of fun, not so much, but they can be. So that's why I guess we're not at 0, that it's okay for story to just be a little bit of fun. That's absolutely fine. It doesn't always have to have a purpose. So this idea of art for art's sake. An important way of preserving our diverse histories and heritages, especially when there's a strong narrative that might be silencing and backgrounding other stories as well, or overwhelming other stories. And I can see Ruth has just put into the chat this idea that some stories can be damaging as well. It's not just the story that matters, who is telling it matters too. So again, leaning more towards agreement there. And the fact that stories can help us, we should have the word can there, but this idea that stories can help us unpack feelings about difficult and complicated issues. Thanks so much. I can see that we're still kind of playing around with that, but we're going to continue. Here we are. Ooh, here we go. Okay. Great, and it's great that we've got some activity in the chat with people agreeing and giving a little bit more thought to some of these statements. That's absolutely what this session is about. You know, get stuck in. You know, put in your ideas and your reflections in there as well. So absolutely, for us, as we went through this project, we were thinking, okay, what is the power of stories, and what's the point of us of stories, and what kind of new myths do we need? As we look back, what kind of new myths do we need for today? So we worked with children on stories from their own and other cultures. And we found some disturbing things about storytelling, right? So sometimes there's stories that we hold very, very deeply in our hearts. But upon reflection, we find some darkness to them as adults and as we're growing up and becoming a little bit more aware of the impact of stories. Some really dark elements to storytelling. and to stories that we love very deeply. And we'll talk about that a little bit more. And that was in the process of developing critical thinking. Like, who is the bad guy or bad girl? You know, who are they? What do they look like? What are they carrying with them? Where do they come from? Even in some of the folk tales that we don't really need to question because they've been around forever, some pretty dark sides to them. We got to practice some storytelling skills as well. We had a lot of fun, you know. So I would say we would call it serious play. Those of you who come from a theater background, this idea that we were quite serious in the process, but we allowed ourselves to play at the same time, to find joy through exploration. And we created new stories around the Sustainable Development Goals, which are a story in themselves, the Sustainable Development Goals. And the website we'll share with you for the project at the end captures some of these stories as well that were created. So why use storytelling in schools? I mean, we know that storytelling is fun and increases motivation. They improve children's ability to think critically and also to improve on their emotional intelligence and engage with conceptual ideas. There is this idea that, oh, well, they increase reading, writing, and oracy, which is all wonderful. But we also recognize that there are different ways of knowing and expression that go beyond reading, writing, and oracy. But we also know that our schools, this is what matters in this particular structure and this particular story that we tell ourselves, is that reading, writing, and oracy are very important. And so our schools play that role. And part of our exploration was what other ways of expression matter that don't really get space in schools. And of course, telling stories from culturally diverse sources. So really looking at diversity, inclusion, representation, equality, and equity through stories. And a big part of this notion around storytelling is the recognition that they're everywhere, right? So Yuval Harari, some of you may be familiar with his book Sapiens, which absolutely at the core of his thesis is this idea that stories make and break civilizations. So, for example, right now we've all bought into this idea that we have 365 days in a year, that this paper that has a pound or dollar sign or lira sign or euro sign or whatever it is, these are valuable, these papers, they're valuable. And we all believe in this story, we get stuck into it. We believe that the world looks like the north is certain countries are at the top and certain countries are at the bottom. We just believe that. So they're all stories from one perspective that we buy into and say, okay, yep, we believe that. We believe in nation states. Something that's a big story as well is the idea of a nation. And we're all believing it. We believe it. We say, we want to believe this story. And that's all good and well when one story or perspective becomes universalized, because we need to cooperate, right? So it's really lovely that we get to cooperate. We have like one way of cooperating and making sense of the world. So in an increasingly globalized world, to be able to get stuck in and cooperate in this way, we have these tools that are common to all of us. But the question is, at what cost are we universalizing? So these notions around universality can become highly problematic when we recognize that in the process of universalizing certain stories, we are invariably silencing others. And so this multiplicity of perspectives, or what's increasingly being used in narratives around decoloniality, pluriversality, what happens when we buy into one narrative is so much else is lost in the process. So how do we wake up to that? And how does that manifest in our classrooms as well? And the stories that we choose to bring into our classrooms, not just in the form of storybooks, but as you very kindly, chucked into the chat box, all these forms of stories and texts that we're inviting into our classrooms. And what's that got to do with racism? And what's that got to do with flipping the narrative in our classrooms from non-racist to anti-racist. That's a story as well. So non-racist is one story, and flipping it into anti-racist is an act of changing the narrative. So let's hear what Marlon James has to say about flipping that narrative.
So I have a question for you. Are you non or are you anti? Several months ago, in response to Ferguson, Baltimore, the killings of Freddie Gray and Tamir Rice, my friend Caitlin put up a Facebook post breaking down the difference between non-racism and anti-racism. Most of us are non-racist. Because racism is looked upon as some moral lapse, we feel quite self-assured by simply not being racist. I'm not a bigot. I don't sing that N-worm when my favorite rap jam comes on. I didn't vote for that guy. I'm not burning any crosses. I'm not a skinhead. I don't, I won't, I'm not, I've never, I can't. What you end up with is an entire moral stance, an entire code for living your life and dealing with all the injustice in the world by not doing a damn thing. That's the great thing about none. You can pull it off by simply rolling over in your bed and going to sleep. So why are you sitting at home and watching things unfold on TV instead of doing something about it? Because you're a non-racist, not an anti-racist. Now do this for me. Take the C out of racist and replace it with a P. I'm not a rapist. I'm not friends with any rapist. I didn't buy that rapist last album. All these things that you're not doing. Meanwhile, people are still getting raped and black boys are being killed. It's not enough that you don't do these things. You're going to bed with a clear conscience is not going to stop college students from getting assaulted. You thinking climate change is terrible is not going to stop climate change. You being so assured that you're not anti-black, anti-Muslim won't stop the next hate crime. And it's wonderful that you recognize how brave gay people are when facing persecution, but they aren't the ones who need to be brave. We need to get active. We need to hold people accountable. We need to accept that what hurts one of us hurts all of us. And we need to stop thinking that injustice going on in the world isn't to an extent our fault. We need to stop being non and start being anti.
Racism is a business.
Okay, so these, I really want to get stuck into the chat. Some really interesting stuff is coming out, but I'm going to keep going and then look later. So please keep populating the chat box for us. So what does that mean in terms of our work in the classroom, and how do we practice anti-racism and decoloniality in the classroom, in what kinds of texts we allow into our classrooms, and how do we assess them? How do we even assess what text we want to allow into the classroom? So we propose using a critical literacy framework in the process of kind of thinking, ooh, you know, how do I know? What questions do I need to ask? And it's this ability to read texts in an active and reflective manner, not least because we want to be aware of the power, the inequality, and the injustice that could be not only maintained, but perpetuated through the storybooks that we are allowing into the classroom. And one of the reasons that we love this video by Marlon James is that he absolutely interrelates all these various oppressions, whether social and environmental, with one another, right? So even when we're talking about anti-racism, we're also talking about climate change and about homophobia. But we're also giving space to anti-racism. Of course we are. We're giving space to this issue, but we're not forgetting everything else. So what is that critical literacy that we're talking about, this framework? Well, here's a question. Who's being foregrounded, backgrounded, or silenced? And I'll just give you an example here from some of the popular sort of TV programs that we're watching, and some of our, you know, young people are watching as well. If we take the example of The Queen's Gambit, great series on Netflix with a very strong woman protagonist. But who's her sidekick? a Black woman who's relatively two-dimensional and who's really only there to support her. We don't get to know too much about her. She's just there as a supporting role. And another one is sex education. Again, the best friend of the protagonist is a gay Black boy. And again, there to support and be the kind of humorous sidekick. Where is the three-roundedness? So even when we're inviting these voices into our story, are we centering them or are we using them as proxies? Is there tokenism in what we are doing? So another question. Who's getting represented and misrepresented? And you'll see that each of these questions are absolutely entangled with one another either. So for example, let's take the representation of the story of the Last Dinner through visuals, which some of you said are a form of storytelling. Palestinian artist Salman Mansour has this image of the Last Supper. And as you can see, the representation is very different from a different perspective. There is another representation as well, which I seem to have not placed here, but you might be able to look for it. And when we share this PowerPoint, I'll make sure that it's in it. But a Northern Syrian artist from the 13th century represents the Last Supper with Black people in it as well. And
next
it's not,
slide, Alia.
It's not there, Trini. I've managed to. I don't know what I've done with it. Thank you. There you go. What we see with this representation, again, is the fact that who is telling this story? And what do they see when they tell this story? And even if they weren't there firsthand, right? What is their interpretation of the story that's been passed on to them? And are we giving platforms to these different voices and perspectives of the same story that we're all sharing? I will never forget also, oh, thank you, Trini. There we go. So you can see there this representation, which is very interesting, how we represent the Last Supper. And why is a Northern Syrian artist from the 13th century being silent? Why is that image being silenced? Why don't we see that one? There's another image as well of the Last Supper, and I'll steal the screen back here, Trini. Okay. There's another one that I couldn't find. I looked for it everywhere, but I remember it clearly. My father used to share this one with us and was so absolutely in love with that picture and representation of the Last Supper, because in it, Jesus is not in the center. Jesus is on the side serving. And that represents a value system of a different culture. And that different culture, the value system, is not about being centered and being in the leadership position. What matters to that culture, Middle Eastern culture, some of you may be familiar with it, is the idea of hospitality, of being of service to your guests, of being generous. These are the values that matter. So again, we see a whole different worldview when we allow these representations into our consciousness and our classrooms. We're inviting different value systems, not just different perspectives in this particular story, but other values start to come into play as well. Who gets to speak and who gets spoken for? Especially when it comes to stories of migration and refugees, there's an absolute lack of representation of refugees and migrants talking about themselves and having the space through published books or on video to speak about their own lived experience, to have authorship over their story. And again, this can become very problematic in terms of power relationships and perpetuating savior mentalities. What would happen if we gave the microphone to a migrant to tell their own story, a refugee to take ownership of their own story? What happens to that narrative of victimhood? Does it get disrupted? Does it not? You know, just that curiosity, who is getting to speak and who is getting spoken for? So just some examples of some popular books that we allow into our classrooms. And you are going to get a chance to have a break from my voice, by the way. We're going to send you into breakout rooms just after this. But research in 2019 by Ishizuka and Stevens into Dr. Seuss books, some of you may be very familiar with this, identified that there are 2,240 human characters, but only 2% are characters of color. And of the 45 characters, 43 exhibit behaviors and appearances that align with harmful and stereotypical Orientalist tropes. Those of us who are familiar with Dr. Seuss books will know exactly what some of these mean. And the remaining 2 characters are identified as African and align with the theme of anti-Blackness. So again, this idea of othering to the point of them being damaging. And they're all male, and they're presented as subservient, exotified, or dehumanized. Another popular book, Charlie and the Chocolate Factory. And the Oompa Loompas originally were African pygmies before Roald Dahl chose to change them into these orange beings. And these orange beings are servants, they're slaves, and they're happy to be slaves. So there are questions around that as well. You know, well, yeah, they're happy to be slaves, they're happy to be servants, they're happy to be subservient. So engaging with these questions of, well, hold on, if we shared that with our children, if we chose to keep with Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, I mean, would you happy to be working and imprisoned? Would it make you happy? And what do you think of this representation? And what assumptions are being made here? And why are all the characters in this book white? What do you make of that? These kinds of questions, inviting them into these books, if we choose to bring them into the classroom. And that's the big question, isn't it? Is when we become aware, now in adulthood, but it could be as children if we have the critical approach and the ability to articulate these critical approaches. When we see this discriminatory content, should we erase these stories and just like not allow these books into our classrooms? Or do we want to confront them with our children? So we are going to send you off into breakout rooms now so that you can have a little discussion around that question. This question of, do we allow, so it's the same question really around the statues debate. Do we keep those statues as testimony to the violent extractive history of Britain in terms of the slave trade and the riches that were built on the back of other countries and peoples? Or do we remove them altogether? So that's our question, and let's apply it to the texts that we use in our classroom in your breakout rooms. Off we go.
I'll open them now. We'll see you in 5 minutes. You'll be back in 5.
Just 5 minutes, thank you. Trini Balaka has just joined us. So we're going to, if we can just assign them into a room. And Jill is with us, as you know. So I told her, unless you wanted
no,
to.
I didn't put her in the room.
Okay. Yeah. To summarize anything that came up for you, arose for you during those discussions as well. Okay. So moving on swiftly. I suppose this quote from Afua Hirsch really captures it all quite nicely, that as long as we send our children out into the world to be actively educated into racism, taught a white supremacist version of history, literature, and art, then we are setting up a future generation to perpetuate the same violence on which that system of power depends. So it is that question of what are we doing in the classroom? How is that radiating out in the world? How is that feeding into systemic racism, which then goes into feeding what we call unconscious bias? And that's a completely different story, but there are all sorts of very interesting theories around our what's called unconscious bias and the fact that it actually comes from the stories we're hearing all the time. So it's not so unconscious, if you like, or at least maybe we can say unconscious bias is consciously orchestrated in some ways. So our critical literacy framework extends beyond those 3 questions. And there are more questions here around who's included and excluded, around what patterns are emerging across the texts, and what social issues are embedded in the text. And importantly for us, whose interests are served, whose agenda is being served, whose story, who's the hero, who's the victor, these kinds of questions. And of course, not every text is going to be able to cover all the issues, but our role is to explore a diversity of perspectives. So when we hear the term decolonize the curriculum, we're not talking about erasing and taking away. We're saying add what's missing, bring it in. You know, you have that book, make sure you've got other books as well. Make sure you've got that pluriversality that we were speaking about, this multiplicity of perspectives as well. This is a little bit of fun also in terms of film for us as adults also to use as a kind of litmus test, if you like. And it's based on the Bechdel test, which some of you may be familiar with from the 1960s, in which these similar questions were asked about films, the role of women in films. So Nadia and Leila Latif, Nadia is quite an established theatre director in the UK, in an article for The Guardian asked these questions, you know, are there 2 or more named characters of color? Are they not romantically involved with one another? Because that's what happens. You kind of just, you're involved with one another, you know. Do they have dialogue about something other than race? And do they ever get to speak about something that isn't comforting or supporting of a white character? And is one of them definitely not magic? And that's just because we have a history of films where the characters are ghosts, or like in Ghost, and in Bruce Almighty, Morgan Freeman plays God. So these kinds of supernatural characters that get played as well. There was also, I'm just going to stop sharing for a minute because Trini, you will have shared a video, a link. So Gillian Harris is with us she's the head of the school's library service in Tower Hamlets. And she was just telling us about this link that Trini just shared about Dr. Seuss cancelling cutting out the racism from the book. So the books are being republished and the racism is being cancelled out of them. And again, that brings this whole narrative around what's come before us. So if we're doing Sankofa, if we're looking at the history of what's coming before us and how we want to create new myths, you know, again, do we allow conversation around what Dr. Seuss used to be, or do we just say, good, the work is done, let's move forward? Some questions around there as well. Okay, great. So the big story of the Sustainable Development Goals, and even with this story of the Sustainable Development Goals that the world as a whole is embracing, we can see elements of that are missing, perspectives that are missing. And in terms of speaking about what elements are missing, am I sharing my screen? I don't think I am anymore. My apologies.
Not yet.
There we go. Gosh, the world of technology. Here we go. In terms of the Sustainable Development Goals as well, these ideas of this big story, these big stories that we consume about what needs to improve and how we're going to be better, this universalizing, who's telling that story? And what's missing when that story is being told from a certain perspective? And even in the process of telling that story, what assumptions are we making and what are we forgetting? And a child from Rathfern Primary School, Cassius Burton, asked for SDG 18. So what Cassius said is, great, you've got gender equality, you've got reduced inequalities, but what about reducing racism? Can we have SDG 18, please? So these kinds of perspectives that we allow, and going back to this idea of the helicopter stories, what stories do our children bring with them? What happens when we open that space for our children to bring in their lived experience, their stories into the space? What happens when we enable them in this way? So there are some great stories out there that we can add, as we were saying. So what are we adding to our collection? These are some storybooks, but I'm sure you know of so many others. And if you wish to share any of them in the chat box, please do. The Tower Hamlets Schools Library Service does have a list of books, and Trini will share that link in the chat box, and we'll share these with you after the session as well.
I just want to add also the slides. You'll get the slides, so don't worry about it.
Thank you, Trini. So yeah, absolutely get stuck in. And I'm gonna have a sneaky look at the chat just because I think there's always interesting stuff that comes out of
And
it.
while Alia looks, if there's anything that you want to add, any of your favorite books to use in schools or the organizations you work at, it would be lovely for you to help us compile a list. We are a lot of, it's all about learning from each other. So if there's any information, please type it on the chat box. Abigail, I want to say your guest is lovely. Your little guest.
So great. Thank you very much also. Ooh, I'm just loving these provocations that are coming in as well, just stuff for us all to kind of think about together and just kind of get stuck in on some of these issues. So in the process of our own journey through anti-racism, so we are an organization led by women of color, and we're constantly kind of interrogating our place and our own approaches, opinions, perspectives, and what we have internalized also in terms of the larger narratives. So we have invited a group of young people called Pupil Power, who you might know, and we've been collaborating with them on quite a bit of our work. And one of the things that they asked of us is, it's great that you do these trainings, but what action are people taking, in the collective endeavor of an anti-racist movement? What action are the participants who come to your trainings taking away? So that's what we want to ask of you now. We've discussed quite a bit. You had the chance also, not much of a chance, I know, but to go into breakout rooms and also detangle and maybe even more tangle even more some of the issues that are coming out. If there was an action that you could take and apply, what would that action be? And here we're going to ask you to commit that action into the chat. So just if you articulate your action into the chat, and I'm also going to look at the chat. Any actions that you are taking away. And the reason I'd like to emphasize this activity as well, because it's what young people from racialized communities have asked of us. So they've said, that's great that we come and help you with these issues, and we're your critical friends and we're collaborating. But, ooh, nice one, Sandhya. I'll be looking at that. Lovely. So finding ways of deconstructing racism, dealing with racist issues immediately, reflecting on the books we use, those key questions to ask with texts, critically assessing what goes into our libraries and the multiplicity of perspectives that we want to invite. So again, this idea around decoloniality being about adding perspectives and adding stories, raising some of these points at staff meetings, because it's a complex process, right? It's not just, you'll all know this better than me, that it's a long and drawn out process where we need to interrogate even the structures of the school itself. So this is just one tiny element looking at the storybooks. What else are we looking at within the whole school structure? Deconstructing myths, absolutely. And including, it's not just the storybooks, we're talking about videos as well, posters. What are we bringing into our classrooms? What are we allowing in? This idea of being led by our young children. What do they want? What do you want? What stories would you tell about yourself? Streamlining what, how, when, and why. Speaking up to colleagues as well, thank you. So allyship, this idea of being an ally and kind of really just stopping and thinking, okay, what can I be doing? So we're interrogating our own practices. Yeah, so we're doing a bit of self-reflection, because that's the process, isn't it? We're starting with ourselves, we're doing our inner work, and we're radiating out as well. Like, okay, and what does that then mean in terms of allyship? What actions can I take? And what does that then mean? Thank you so much. These are all great, absolutely great contributions. And please keep them going in the chat. And in the meantime, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about, hold on a minute. I've got a few things popping up on my screen. There we go. So in terms of our learning guide and toolkit that we're going to share with you as a result of this, we will require you to please also complete an evaluation form in order to receive this material. The reason we need the evaluation forms are for our funders as well. So that's an important part of the process for us. So yes, tips, tricks, and methodologies to improve storytelling techniques, tried and tested classroom activities to work with children, critical thinking tools to think about values and attitudes through storytelling, and of course, adult level thinking as well of the power of storytelling and why we need to skill up our children and ourselves in being authors of our own stories that we want to put out there. So on the one hand, being critically equipped to look at other stories, and on the other hand, to also empower ourselves in telling stories where there's been silence or a void, or these stories have been backgrounded. And we've got these resources. So we've got a learning guide and we've got a toolkit. The learning guide is more about methodology and practical ways of engaging with students. And the toolkit has a bank of activities. And as I said, if you can please complete our evaluation form, that would be grand. And that's it. Let us know how we got on. Thank you very much for the chat. That was really animated. We've taken a lot from what you have shared. I'm going to go back and look at it more closely. These are always learning opportunities for us as well. And yeah, and please, anything that comes up for you, feel free to email us. We're also around now if anyone wants to stay back and ask questions there.
Yes, Ali, if I can add, so tomorrow we'll be sending you the slides and we will be sending you a copy of the chat with all the wonderful resources and links and comments that you have shared. So if you can please go to the link for the evaluation, it literally takes 2 minutes. Help us with that. And thank you for attending today's session. You make it even extra wonderful. I wanted to say about the recording. I see someone was mentioning the recording. It's going to be available once it's edited or as part of the content on our sankofastorytelling.eu website. So you'll get the link that, the slides have the link to the website, and yeah, all the content will be there.
Thank you for coming. Thank you, Lisa. We see you. Or Liza, I'm sorry if I'm misspelling, but thank you. We see you. We hear you. Thank you very much. Thank you, Sandia. And thank you also for the criticality you brought in, Sandia. We're really, we have to have that voice within us. We have to feel comfortable to challenge each other. We really appreciate that. Thank you very much, Angela, Gemma, Miguel, Anna. Thank you. Thank you, Patricia, as well. Thank you. M. Soldfield, I'm sorry, I don't know your first name, but thank you also, just to say thank you very much. We hear you, we receive your thanks. Abigail, we say hello to your daughter or the child who's with you in the space as well.
Best guest so far.
Sandia, we have to touch base. I'm just going to say if maybe through Sue we can touch base and just see how we can, expand the conversation. Where's the evaluation, Trini? Shall I share it again or should we put it in the chat? We're going to put it in the chat. Abigail, yes, your foster daughter. Thank you, Maria. Thanks for coming.
Miss Oldfield, her name is Carol. Thank you, Carol. Yes, Miss Oldfield. That's Carol. Hello. Thank you.
Oh, it's
Thank you
Miss
for coming.
Oldfield. I'm so
Yes,
sorry.
I know her from before, from a
Insulted.
different. I remember this. Yeah, maybe. Yeah, from before. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Stella. Thank you very much for coming.
Can I just check, if I leave, can I still do the evaluation, or does that shut at the same time?
We have the link, and if not, we can email you the link again with the resources, or I know where to find you.
Yes, true. Thank you. Can I ask you one more thing? This is from the last one of the